There are people who walk through life with a different kind of sight, not the kind that sees colors more vividly or details more sharply, but the kind that perceives the weight beneath words, the silence between heartbeats, the truth hiding behind polite smiles. They feel the texture of existence itself, and in a world built on surfaces, this becomes their quiet burden. You meet someone. The conversation flows. There's laughter, shared stories, the gentle dance of getting to know another soul. But somewhere in the middle of it all, you notice something. A dissonance, a gap between what's being said and what's actually happening. They speak of love, but you sense fear. They describe their dreams, but you feel their resignation. And suddenly you're no longer in the moment. You're seeing through it, around it, beneath it. You're awake in a room where everyone else is sleepwalking. This is the paradox of spiritual awakening when it meets the realm of love. To see clearly seems like it should be an advantage, a gift that allows you to choose wisely, to connect authentically, to love deeply. And yet, the very consciousness that promises profound connection becomes the wall that keeps it at bay. The more awake you become, the harder it is to find someone who isn't still dreaming. Martin Heidegger spoke of authentic existence, of living in truth, rather than in the comfortable falsehoods we inherit from the world around us. He understood that most people exist in what he called das Man, the anonymous they, living according to scripts written by others, never questioning, never truly choosing, never fully awake to their own being. To awaken spiritually is to step out of this collective slumber. It's to see the mechanisms, to question the narratives, to refuse the easy answers that everyone else accepts without thought. But here's what the philosophy books don't tell you. Here's what you only learn when you've actually made that journey. Awakening doesn't just change how you see the world. It changes how you exist in relationship, and that changes everything. When you become spiritually awake, you start to notice patterns that others miss. You see how people use love as an escape rather than as a path. You watch them seek partners not to truly know another soul, but to avoid knowing themselves. You observe the transactions disguised as romance, the negotiations masked as intimacy, the fear of loneliness dressed up as devotion. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You can't pretend, you can't play the game the way everyone else plays it. I once knew someone who described dating after their spiritual awakening as trying to dance to music only they could hear. Everyone else was moving to a different rhythm, following steps they'd learned from movies and songs and the collective agreement about what love is supposed to look like. But this person could hear something else, a deeper melody, a truer tempo. And no matter how hard they tried to synchronize with the dance floor around them, they remained slightly out of step, always a beat ahead or behind, forever feeling like a stranger at a party where everyone else seemed to know the choreography by heart. The spiritually awake person enters the realm of dating and relationships with a different set of needs. Not better needs, not worse needs, but fundamentally different ones. While others seek security, they seek truth. While others pursue passion, they pursue presence. While others want someone to complete them, they want someone to meet them in their completeness. These aren't impossible desires, but in a world where most people are still trying to fill holes inside themselves with another person, these needs can feel impossibly specific. You sit across from someone at dinner. They're attractive, kind, successful by conventional measures. The conversation is pleasant. They check all the boxes that society told you matter. But as they speak, you notice something missing. Not something they lack as a person, but something they haven't yet discovered in themselves. A depth, a questioning nature, a willingness to sit in uncertainty. They speak with such certainty about things you know are infinitely complex. They have their life figured out, their path laid clear, their identity solidified. And you realize, with a kind of gentle sadness, that what you're looking for isn't someone who has all the answers. You're looking for someone who's fallen in love with the questions. Heidegger wrote about being toward death, the idea that authentic existence requires us to acknowledge our mortality, to live with full awareness of our finite nature. For the spiritually awakened, this isn't morbid philosophy, it's daily reality. They feel the preciousness of time, the brevity of this existence, the miracle of consciousness itself. And this awareness makes them allergic to superficiality. Small talk feels like a violation of the sacred. Pretense feels like a waste of the precious moments we have. Games and strategies and playing it cool. All of it feels like an elaborate way of avoiding the one thing that matters. Genuine human connection, in full awareness of its temporary nature. But try explaining this on a first date. Try expressing that you're not interested in casual conversation because you're too aware of mortality to waste time on words that mean nothing. Try telling someone that you need depth, truth, authenticity, not because you're demanding or difficult, but because you've seen through the illusion and you can't go back to pretending it's real. You sound intense, you sound heavy, you sound like too much. And so begins the second layer of the struggle. The spiritually awake person learns to hide their awakeness. They learn to dim their light, to speak less truth, to pretend they don't see what they see. They go on dates and nod along to conversations that feel empty. They match on apps with people whose profiles reveal an unexamined life, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there's more beneath the surface. They compromise, not because they want to, but because the alternative is a solitude so complete it sometimes feels unbearable. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with spiritual awakening. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone. Many awakened people actually cherish solitude. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen, of speaking and not being understood, of reaching out and finding no hand that grasps yours with equal awareness. It's the loneliness of a language that no one else speaks, of seeing a world that no one else quite perceives the same way. This loneliness shows up most acutely in romantic contexts, because romance, more than any other human endeavor, promises total connection. It promises to end our isolation, to give us a companion who truly knows us. For the spiritually awake person, this promise is both deeply desired and almost impossibly elusive. How do you find true companionship when your very sense of truth is different from most people around you? I've watched this pattern play out countless times. The awakened person meets someone who seems promising. There's attraction, chemistry, shared interests. They begin to open up, to share their deeper thoughts, their spiritual insights, their way of seeing the world. And one of two things happens. Either the other person doesn't understand and dismisses it as too philosophical or overthinking, or they become fascinated in a way that's almost worse. They treat the awakened person as a guru, a teacher, someone to learn from rather than to love as an equal. Neither dynamic creates the foundation for true partnership. In the first scenario, the awakened person learns to hide themselves, to edit their truth, to exist in a relationship that touches only the surface of who they are. In the second scenario, they become an object of admiration rather than a subject of love. They're placed on a pedestal, which is just another form of separation, another way of not being truly met. Heidegger spoke of being with, the fundamental human condition of existing alongside others. But he distinguished between authentic being with, where we encounter others in their true existence, and inauthentic being with, where we relate to others through roles, expectations, and social scripts. For the spiritually awake, most relationships feel like the latter. They're surrounded by people but rarely truly with anyone, and in love this gap becomes a chasm. The awakened person begins to wonder if perhaps they've gone too far, if perhaps their spiritual journey has taken them to a place so remote that no bridge can span the distance back to ordinary human connection. They watch couples around them, couples who seem happy in their unawareness, content in their conventional love stories, and they wonder if ignorance truly is bliss. If perhaps awakening wasn't worth the price after all. But here's what makes it even more complex. The spiritually awake person can't simply choose someone who's also spiritually awake and call it solved. Because spiritual awakening isn't a club with membership cards. It's not a category you can filter for on a dating app. Two people can both consider themselves spiritually awake and still be walking entirely different paths, speaking entirely different languages, seeking entirely different truths. One person's awakening might lead them toward Buddhism, another's toward non-duality, another's toward earth-based spirituality, another's toward existential philosophy. One might awaken through meditation, another through psychedelics, another through loss, another through love itself. And these different paths create different worldviews, different values, different ways of being, that don't automatically harmonize just because both people have awakened. Moreover, spiritual communities themselves can become their own kind of trap. The awakened person ventures into conscious dating circles, spiritual retreats, New Age gatherings, hoping to find kindred spirits. And what they often find instead is a different kind of performance. People who have replaced conventional masks with spiritual ones, who use enlightenment language to avoid genuine intimacy, who've turned awakening itself into another identity to hide behind. You meet someone who speaks fluently about presence, mindfulness, tantric connection, sacred union. The words are beautiful, the concepts are profound, but as you get closer, you realize that the spiritual language has become a sophisticated defense mechanism. They can talk about vulnerability but can't practice it. They can discuss ego dissolution but can't admit when they're wrong. They've created a spiritual persona so convincing that even they believe it, never realizing they've simply traded one form of sleep for another. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of the spiritually awake person's search for love. They've awakened precisely to see through personas, to transcend false identities, to live in truth. And yet they find themselves in a landscape where even spiritual awakening has become another persona to perform, another identity to construct, another way to avoid the raw, messy, completely unspiritual reality of actual human intimacy. Real love, the kind the awakened person yearns for, requires something that awakening alone doesn't guarantee: the willingness to be foolish, to be wrong, to be scared and small and confused, to not have it figured out, to stumble and fail and show up anyway. Spiritual awakening can sometimes create a subtle arrogance, a sense that we've transcended the ordinary struggles of human existence. But love doesn't care about your enlightenment. Love asks you to be human, fully and completely, with all the clumsiness that entails. The struggle intensifies when the awakened person realizes that finding love isn't just about finding another awakened soul. It's about finding someone whose particular form of awakeness is compatible with their own, someone whose wounds don't trigger yours in destructive ways, someone whose growth trajectory is moving in a complementary direction, someone whose way of processing the world meshes with yours in that mysterious way that makes partnership possible. And these requirements, they're not pickiness. They're not the awakened person being too demanding or too selective. They're recognition of a fundamental truth, that sustainable love requires a certain level of compatibility in how we see and move through the world. The spiritually awake person has often tried to force connection with those who don't share their wavelength, and they've learned the hard way that no amount of attraction or effort can bridge certain fundamental gaps in consciousness. So what happens? Many awakened people choose solitude, not as a defeat but as a conscious choice. They create rich, full lives of creativity, service, deep friendships, and spiritual practice. They learn to meet their need for intimacy through various forms of connection, rather than putting all that weight on romantic partnership. They make peace with the possibility that romantic love, at least of the kind they truly desire, might not be part of their path in this lifetime. There's a dignity in this choice, but also a grief, because the human heart doesn't stop longing just because the mind has made peace with reality. The desire for partnership, for someone to build a life with, for the particular kind of intimacy that only romantic love provides, this doesn't disappear with spiritual awakening. If anything, it sometimes intensifies, becomes more specific, more poignant, because the awakened person knows exactly what kind of love they're missing. Others take a different path. They choose to stay in the search, but they refine their approach. They stop trying to make themselves smaller to fit into conventional dating norms. They stop hiding their depth. They become radically honest about who they are and what they need, knowing this will eliminate 99% of potential partners, but trusting that the 1% who remain will be genuine possibilities. This approach requires tremendous courage. It means facing rejection not for your surface qualities, but for your essential nature. It means putting your deepest self on display and watching people walk away. But it also means that when someone does stay, when someone does respond with recognition and resonance, you know it's real. You know you're being chosen for who you actually are, not for the edited version you presented. I've seen awakened people find love this way, not often and not easily, but genuinely. Two people who've done their inner work, who've faced their shadows, who've learned to be with themselves, who speak the same underlying language of consciousness. They find each other. And when they do, what they create isn't the fairy tale that the unawakened chase. It's something rawer, more real, more challenging, and far more profound. But here's what Heidegger understood that many modern spiritual teachings miss. Authenticity isn't a destination. It's not a state you achieve and then maintain. It's a constant practice of choosing truth over comfort, awareness over habit, presence over autopilot. And in relationship, this means that even two awakened people will constantly be navigating the territory between their separate authenticities. Awakened love isn't conflict-free. It isn't always harmonious or easy. Two people who can both see clearly will sometimes see different things. Two people who refuse to play games will sometimes hurt each other with their honesty. Two people who are committed to growth will sometimes grow in directions that create tension. The difference is that they do this consciously. They navigate the difficulty with awareness rather than denial, with communication rather than avoidance, with commitment to truth rather than commitment to comfort. This kind of love requires skills that spiritual awakening doesn't automatically provide. It requires learning to communicate not just your insights, but your needs. Learning to hold space for another's process without trying to fix or teach. Learning to be vulnerable about your actual feelings rather than just your philosophical observations. Learning that sometimes your partner needs you to just be human with them, rather than enlightened about them. The spiritually awake person often struggles with these practical aspects of intimacy precisely because they've become so skilled at the transcendent aspects. They can hold space for existential questions, but freeze up when asked, "What do you need from me right now?" They can discuss the nature of consciousness for hours, but struggle to simply say, "I'm scared," or "I'm hurt," or "I need to be held." Awakening opens the mind, expands awareness, deepens perception. But it doesn't automatically heal the heart's old wounds. It doesn't erase the attachment patterns formed in childhood. It doesn't make us immune to fear or insecurity, or the very human need to protect ourselves from pain. And in relationship, these unhealed parts emerge, often surprising the awakened person who thought they'd transcended such basic human struggles. This is where many spiritually awake people face their greatest challenge in love. Integrating their expanded consciousness with their very human heart. Learning that spiritual awakening and emotional availability are different skills that don't automatically come together. Discovering that you can be profoundly awake and still have relationship patterns that sabotage connection. Realizing that seeing the truth about existence doesn't mean you've healed all the ways you learned to protect yourself from love. The path forward isn't about finding a perfect awakened partner who requires no work, no compromise, no navigation of human complexity. It's about bringing the same consciousness that we apply to cosmic questions down into the messy, ordinary, completely unspiritual reality of sharing space with another flawed, beautiful, struggling human being. It's about recognizing that awakening doesn't place us above the human experience. It places us more fully within it. We see the truth, yes, but we're still walking around in bodies that get tired, and emotions that get triggered, and egos that occasionally hijack our awareness. And love asks us to show up in our full humanity, not just our enlightened moments. The spiritually awake person who finds sustainable love is usually someone who's learned to balance their transcendent awareness with their intimate humanity. They can zoom out to the cosmic perspective when it serves, but they can also zoom into the immediate reality of this person, this moment, this small gesture of kindness or moment of connection. They haven't chosen between awakening and humanity. They've learned to hold both. Perhaps the deepest reason spiritually awake people struggle to find love is that love itself requires a kind of surrender that feels counterintuitive to awakening. Spiritual growth often involves disidentification, learning that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your body, not your story. But love requires identification. Choosing this person, this connection, this commitment in a world where you could choose anyone or nothing at all. Love asks you to make something supremely important, even though your awakened consciousness knows that all things are ultimately impermanent and empty of inherent meaning. It asks you to care deeply, even though you've seen through the illusion of separation. It asks you to attach even though you've learned the suffering that attachment brings. It asks you to choose definitively and repeatedly, in a reality where you know that all choices are ultimately arbitrary. This is the paradox at the heart of awakened love. You must hold both truths simultaneously, the absolute truth of our fundamental unity and the relative truth of your deep care for this particular manifestation of consciousness. You must be both detached enough to give your partner freedom and attached enough to stay through the hard parts. You must remember that you are already complete, while also opening yourself to being transformed by another. Not everyone who awakens can hold this paradox. Some retreat into the absolute and dismiss relationship as attachment or delusion. Others sacrifice their awakening to disappear into conventional partnership. The rare ones who manage to walk the middle path, they're the ones who demonstrate that awakened love is possible, though never easy, and never what the unawakened world told us love should be. These people have learned something crucial. They've learned that the consciousness which allows them to see through everything must also see through its own tendency to dismiss, to judge, to hold itself separate through its very superiority of vision. They've learned to be awake without being apart, to see clearly without seeing coldly, to know the truth without wielding it as a weapon against those who are still finding their way. And when two people who've learned this meet, something extraordinary becomes possible. Not a fairy tale, but a real tale. Not a perfect love, but an authentic one. Not an escape from the human condition, but a full embrace of it, with eyes wide open, hearts willing to break and mend and break again. Hands held through the darkness that awakening reveals, but doesn't remove. In the end, perhaps spiritually awake people don't struggle to find love because love is incompatible with awakening. They struggle because they're looking for a kind of love that's rare, that requires both people to have done work that most will never do, that asks for a level of consciousness and courage that the conventional world doesn't even know is possible. They struggle because they refuse to settle for the love stories that satisfied them before they woke up. Because they've tasted something true, and imitation tastes like ash in their mouth. Because they'd rather be alone in their truth than companioned in comfortable illusion. And maybe that's not a struggle at all. Maybe it's simply the cost of consciousness and the price they're willing to pay because they know that on the other side of that particular darkness, there's a kind of connection that makes every lonely night worthwhile. A love that meets them exactly where they are. A partnership that doesn't ask them to dim their light or deepen their sleep. A recognition so complete that it feels like coming home to a place they've never been but have somehow always known. The spiritually awake person doesn't need to be fixed or changed to find love. They need to be patient. They need to trust that their particular frequency, however rare, is being broadcast into a universe where someone, somewhere, is tuned to exactly that station. They need to keep showing up fully, keep refusing to compromise their truth, keep holding space for the possibility that awakened love exists not despite the difficulty, but because of it. Because in a world that's still mostly sleeping, two people who can meet each other in wakefulness, who can love each other with eyes open, who can build a life together without building illusions, that's not just a relationship. That's a revolution, a quiet one, invisible to most, but absolutely real. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Maybe the struggle itself is sacred, refining us into people capable of the very love we seek, preparing us for a meeting that could never happen until we became exactly who we needed to be. The sun rises whether anyone watches it or not. The truth exists whether anyone acknowledges it or not. And love, real, awakened, conscious love, it exists too, quiet and rare, waiting for those brave enough to stay awake while they search for it, patient enough to know that what's real never comes easy, and wise enough to recognize it when it finally arrives.